in poetry. The first one we're looking at is Stevie Smith's Not Waving but Drowning. Nobody heard him, the dead man, but still he lay moaning. I was much further out than you thought, and not waving but drowning. Poor chap, he always loved larking, and now he's dead. It must have been too cold for him. His heart gave way, they said. Oh, no, 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 it was too cold always, still the dead one lay moaning. I was much too far out all my life, and not waving, but drowning. This one is a pretty powerful piece. It affects a lot of people who read it because it kind of gives us this whole impression of how some people manage to hide some of the traumas that are going on in their lives for an extended period of time even. The rest of the world doesn't see that there's a problem, but there is. Some people are on like a self-destruct mechanism there, and there's nothing anybody can really do to stop it. Stevie Smith herself was kind of on a bit of a self-destruct path. Let me tell you just a little bit about her. It might give you some insight into her piece right here. She was born in 1902. She despised her father because he ran off from and abandoned his family when she was a very young child. She was agnostic and often antagonistic toward Christianity as a whole, but she said there was always a danger that she would lapse into belief. When she was 5, she developed tuberculosis and went into a sanatorium, and she remained in that facility for several years. She dates her preoccupation with death from that time when she was about 7 years old, and she was so miserable that she tried to wish herself to death. She refused to eat, and she cried and cried, but alas, she did not die. And so she made a decision that, well, she just put it off and summon up death if she had the need to at a later date. The concept of death fascinated her and was the subject of a lot of her poems. Her mother died of heart disease when she was 16, which was a very harrowing experience for her. Her aunt raised her, but wasn't really supportive of what she did. She actually went to secretarial college. She found a guy that she liked, but she decided she didn't want to marry him. And she submitted some of her poems later on, and those were accepted. There's some indication that she had some lesbian relationships, but that's kind of always up for some sort of debate. But in 1953, this is what's so interesting and kind of ties into her poem, she had a crisis at work, and nobody really knows what happens, but she tried to cut her wrists, tried to commit suicide, but it didn't happen. She became ill in about 1970 and couldn't find words, and what it happened to be was a tumor that she suffered from, and she eventually died from that tumor. But how tragic for a poet to lose their ability to find words. But Stevie Smith, she had kind of that type of life that she lived relatively on the outside normally, but had a lot of those things going on inside her. This poem is very reminiscent of the poem we'll look at in just a little while, Richard Cory, which has that same theme of people who on the outside appear to have everything or appear to be doing just fine, when in reality they're not. I always find it fascinating when I read this poem. Years ago, you didn't find very many people who knew someone who had committed suicide or knew of someone, and now it is just such a common thing for people to have been a part of and know about. It's just very tragic in our society, but it does lend itself to that notion there, that poem does, of how we as individuals do try to hide and mask what's going on inside of us a lot of times. The next poem that we're looking at in this section is Dorothy Parker's Indian Summer. Now, whereas Stevie Smith had some trouble dealing with it, Dorothy Parker figured out a way. She says in Indian Summer, you know, I got over it. In youth, it was a way I had to do my best to please, and change with every passing lad to suit his theories. But now I know the things I know and do the things I do, and if you do not like me so, to hell, my love, with you. So Dorothy Parker was an interesting character as well. What you see with this poem is a closed poem, traditional poem, has that rhyme scheme going on. She's got an interesting theme there. You know, she says, you know, when I was younger, I molded myself to be whatever I was supposed to be. But as she learned and grew into adulthood and got a little older, she realized, I am who I am, and I'm not going to apologize for that. Which looks at, and when we look at that in relation to the title, Indian Summer, we see that Indian Summer is that period of time, you know, after the spring of your youth and you're in full bloom in summer, and fall, everything's going down, and then sometimes a second summer happens. It's a rejuvenation, and then there will be this flourishing of wildflowers, and even animals will have another batch of babies and things, because the weather changes and improves, and it's just like a new springtime that occurs. Another living season shows up there again before the winter time. And so she's actually come back to life in this latter part of her life in comparison to what she used to be. She has reborn herself and rebirthed into an individual and who she wants to be. So it's really neat. But Dorothy Parker was a pistol, a very interesting woman. Let me read you another poem of hers. It's just a little short one. Razors pain you, rivers are damp, acids stain you, and drugs cause cramp. Guns aren't lawful, nooses give, gas smells awful, you might as well live. Called a resume. She's very interesting because she was a wicked wit. She was a critic, and people kind of feared that sharp, biting tongue. Dorothy Parker, actually, interesting kind of a childhood there, can give you an idea about that last little piece I read. She was born in 1893. Her youth was marked by tragedy. Her mother died when she was 4. Her brother Henry died on the Titanic, and her father died shortly after. She was educated at private schools. She worked as a pianist for a dancing school. She married a stockbroker, but it didn't make it. She was a member of the Algonquin Round Table, which had amazing people, James III, George Kaufman, and others. Oh my goodness. She befriended Ernest Hemingway. She contributed her works to the New Yorker and Life magazine. She was regarded as brilliant but pessimistic, an amazing conversationalist. But she suffered from depression and alcoholism and attempted suicide 3 times. She was blacklisted during the 1940s for her support of radical causes, and actually called before the House on un-American activities in the 1950s. You remember the McCarthy era, McCarthyism, her socialist leanings. She got nailed for that. In 1967, she was found dead of a heart attack, and she bequeathed her entire literary estate to the NAACP. So she was certainly a fascinating woman, a fascinating poet with a wicked wit. You can see that in Indian Summer. But she also is kind of like the character in Not Waving but Drowning. That outside, everything seems to be going well, but inside, just drowning. So very fascinating character there. Okay, our next one is Theodore Rothke's My Papa's Waltz. Now this particular piece, and even with the responses that I've been getting on that it is one of those pieces that can be looked at from either a positive standpoint or a negative standpoint, depending most typically on the way a person was raised. That's usually the key, is what kind of experiences a person has had in their childhood, or with spouses, or siblings, or grandparents, parents, whatever. That usually determines whether someone sees this as a positive or a negative point. And in honesty, it can be interpreted both ways. Let's look at it first, though. My Papa's Waltz. The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. Such waltzing was not easy. We romped until the pans slid from the kitchen's shelf. My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. The hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle. At every step you missed, my right ear scraped a buckle. You beat time on my head with a palm caked hard by dirt, then waltzed me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt. Now, if we look at this poem, we can see it from both a positive and negative perspective. We could see a father who probably stopped off by the bar on his way home to unwind after a hard day. His hands are beat up, he's dirty and scruffy, probably put in a long day at work. He comes in, he spends just a few quality moments with his child. He grabs him up and dances him around the room while Mama's trying to get the kid calmed down for bed, and Dad's stirring him up, and then he heads him off to bed, and it's just a kind of a lovely childhood memory, a lovely snapshot again in time of a child with just a few wonderful moments with a hardworking father. Other people, though, who have had experiences with alcoholics see this as a potentially very dangerous situation. They see the child clinging, hanging on, not fighting back. They see the mother's countenance not unfrowning itself because she is terrified of what might happen. Most people know that in certain situations an alcoholic can become extremely violent and volatile at any given situation. If she were to step in, it could cause a situation. The knuckle is battered. You beat time on my head, and he indicates that he has the hand that held my wrist, not the hand that held my hand as we waltzed, but held my wrist. I've actually had in some classes people get into a knockdown drag out as whether this is a positive or a negative poem, depending on their childhood experiences. One thing I will tell you, though, is that Theodore Rothke did battle alcoholism himself, and his father was an alcoholic. Now, whether that turns it into a negative poem for you or not, that is entirely up to you. I wouldn't begin to tell you, based on how it exists right here, whether or not you should see it as a positive or negative, because you can see it from either direction. George Herbert's Easter Wings is an absolutely stunning piece of work for several reasons. One, if you look at it, the date, 1633, so it has that kind of timeless theme going on in terms of Easter. But one of the things, what I want you to notice is that it is a shaped poem. And if you turn the book onto its side, what you're looking at is a set of wings. So physically, the poem takes on the appearance of wings. And then, when you read the poem, if you read it with the right intonation, from loud to soft to loud to soft back to loud, it has the meaning follows the tone and the sound of the poem. When it's all good and right and a person is close to God, it's big and strong and wide. When the person gets away from God, they become small and thin and fragile. As they get back close to God, they spread out again, and it's loud and the wings spread out again. So to have constructed a poem that both has meaning of being with and without God, and then physically it looks on the page with and without, and then when it's read aloud you can see going from large to small. It's just a phenomenal piece of poetry, the way that it's structured. So I'm going to try to do it justice here. Easter Wings. Lord, who createst man in wealth and store, though foolishly he lost the same, decaying more and more, till he became most poor. With thee, O let me rise as larks harmoniously, and sing this day thy victories. Then shall the fall further the flight in me. Now, when we see that first section there, what we see is God created man with all he needed. But what did mankind go and do? Screwed it up and decayed until he became very poor and nothing. But if that person will rise again with God, connect themselves, they will spread out again, and their fall back to nothingness will be that much further. Now let's look at what he does in the second section. My tender age and sorrow did begin, and still with sickness and shame thou didst so punish sin, that I became most thin. With thee let me combine, and feel this day thy victory. For if I imp my wing on thine, affliction shall advance the flight in me. So again he's saying, you had to punish sin in me, this person, and I became small and weak and thin. But if I can combine myself back with you and feel your victory through me, and imp, which means to connect or attach my wing to you, the flight will advance. In bad things that happen to me will only advance my flight to you, will only make me closer and stronger to you. So whether you're a religious person or not, what I want you to see in the poem itself is just how much that poet had to put into that to create this on all of those different levels. And if you are a religious person, it goes to the heart of what you are with God and what you are without God. Okay, now I've got what the motorcycle said, but I don't have him close to me, so I'm going to have to put that one on for you later. So let's go now to Richard Cory on 782 from our textbook. And again, this one has that kind of dark feeling again. You can tell it's a closed poem because it's set in stanzas. A closed or a traditional poem has stanzas and a rhyme scheme, and the end lines rhyme. So you can physically look down at a poem, and if it has stanzas and they rhyme at the ends, you know you have a traditional or closed poem. Richard Cory. When Richard Cory went to town, we people on the pavement looked at him. He was a gentleman from sole to crown, clean, favored, and imperially slim. And he was always quietly arrayed, and he was always human when he talked. But still he fluttered pulses when he said, "Good morning," and he glittered when he walked. He was rich, yes, richer than a king, and admirably schooled in every grace. In fine, we thought that he was everything to make us wish we were in his place. So on we worked and waited for the light, and went without the meat and cursed the bread. And Richard Cory, one calm summer night, went home and put a bullet through his head. So again, we see that whole notion of what one appears on the outside to be versus what's going on inside them. So we have that same notion that we see in Steve Smith's Not Waving but Drowning. The next one we have is Carl Sandburg's Fog on 795, and this one is an extended metaphor. Of course, it's that natural comparison of fog to sneaking in on little cat feet. One of the reasons that I include this poem specifically, though, is for those individuals who are going to be educators, especially elementary education teachers. This is a wonderful poem to use to initiate kids into poetry. This poem, they can illustrate, they can color and make all kinds of drawings, but they can also use this poem to create their own poetry. They can, instead of the frog comes in on little cat feet, the frog hops in on green webbed feet, or whatever you want to use, and a horse can gallop in, or a bird can fly down, or whatever you want for that that anything that child wants to use, but it gives them opportunity to create their own poetry and create their own image there. So that's one of the reasons I included it, because it is such a good one for kids to work with. It sits looking over the harbor and city on silent haunches and then moves on. So you get this image of the fog rolling in quietly and sneaking up on everybody and having it be there before they even realize it, and then sneaking out again and disappearing before a person realizes it. But there are lots of things that you can connect that to. But one of the things that I wanted people to see this one for is for its use in helping kids kind of become accustomed to the poetry itself. Okay, there we are for that section. And off I go.